Hello, Aquarius, and welcome back to Henry Sacred Tarot. My name is Henry. If you enjoy reflective and healing tarot readings, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue these journeys together. And if there's anything you'd like me to pray over, send positive energy toward, or simply hold space for, feel free to share it in the comments below. Okay, this is a general reading for the Aquarius Collective, so take what resonates with your journey and allow the rest to simply pass by. I always encourage you to stay open to whatever messages may come through during our time together. I'm simply the messenger here. The most important voice in this reading is, and always will be, your own intuition. So as these cards begin to unfold, allow yourself to connect with them directly. Listen not only to the words you hear, but also to the feelings, memories, and quiet realizations that may surface along the way. And Aquarius, can I tell you something? The most important part of any tarot reading has never been the reader. It's always been you, your wisdom, your intuition, your connection to your own inner truth. Wow, the energy already feels very interesting. So let's take a deep breath together and see what wants to come through today. Aquarius, wow. The very first thing I'm noticing as I look at these cards is that somebody has been thinking about you far more than they've ever allowed themselves to admit. And what's interesting is that this doesn't feel impulsive. It doesn't feel like a passing thought or a random moment of nostalgia. It's almost like this energy has been sitting quietly beneath the surface for quite some time, but recently it's become impossible for them to ignore. The harder they try to focus on other things, the more their mind seems to drift back to you. I keep seeing the energy of the Six of Cups card coming through here, and it feels like old memories are slowly making their way back to the surface. Maybe it was a simple conversation the two of you once had, a short text message, a comment that seemed insignificant at the time. A moment where the two of you laughed about something completely ordinary. But somehow, those memories never really left. It's like someone driving down a familiar road and suddenly hearing an old song they haven't heard in years. And within seconds, they're transported back to a moment they thought they had forgotten. Can I tell you something? What really stands out to me here is that this person isn't just remembering you. They're looking back at everything from a completely different perspective now. There was a time when they seemed consumed by whatever was directly in front of them, their responsibilities, their worries, their personal struggles, the things they believed deserved all of their attention. But now, as they look back, they're beginning to realize there were things they didn't fully understand at the time. They're starting to understand what you were trying to communicate, what you were hoping for, what you were quietly asking for, and they're beginning to see things they may have unintentionally overlooked. The Star card comes through here in such a beautiful way, because I don't feel like they're only remembering events. I feel like they're remembering a feeling, the feeling of being around you. You know, some people leave an impact on our lives through major events, but others leave an impact simply through their presence. Just by making an ordinary day feel a little lighter, just by bringing a different kind of energy into the room, just by making the world seem a little less heavy. And Aquarius, I think this person is finally beginning to understand that. Maybe they never had the words for it before. Maybe they couldn't quite identify what made your presence feel different. But now that some distance exists, or now that things aren't exactly the way they used to be, they're starting to recognize the value of those simple moments. And what's interesting is that the Nine of Swords card appears right beside it, which tells me not all of these thoughts are comfortable. Not all of these realizations feel easy. There are moments when they lie awake thinking longer than they intended to. Moments when they wonder if they missed something important, if they misunderstood something, if they were too stubborn at a certain point in time. This doesn't feel like someone trying to move on. Actually, it feels like the opposite. It feels like someone who keeps moving forward only to discover that something inside them still keeps pulling them back toward these thoughts. I feel like they've gone through a phase where they tried to explain everything through logic. But feelings don't always work that way. Some connections don't fit neatly into logical boxes. Sometimes a person simply occupies more space in your mind than seems reasonable. And that's exactly what I'm picking up on here, Aquarius. This person keeps thinking about the way you see the world, the way you communicate, the way you bring a completely different perspective into situations. And what's funny is that they seem to remember the smallest details now, things they never imagined would matter. A certain expression, a habit you had, a phrase you repeated often, little things, ordinary things. Yet somehow those details have become incredibly meaningful in their memory. And the longer I sit with these cards, the more I feel like this awareness is still expanding. because something inside this person is changing. They're beginning to see a much bigger picture, a wider understanding of what this connection has actually brought into their life. And from that moment forward, the feeling of missing you seems to grow in a way that even they are finding harder and harder to ignore. And what really catches my attention next is that this energy doesn't seem content to stay in the realm of thoughts anymore. Because whenever the Knight of Cups card appears, I often get the feeling that something inside a person is beginning to move. Not in a rushed way, not in a reckless way, but more like someone who has spent a very long time thinking about something and is now starting to wonder whether it's finally time to do something differently. Aquarius. I feel like this person has been spending a lot of time imagining what it would be like to see you smile again. And I know that sounds simple, but that's exactly what keeps showing up in their energy. Not grand fantasies, not elaborate scenarios, just ordinary moments, a gentle conversation, a message arriving after a long period of silence, a familiar laugh, a look that somehow makes the stress of the entire day fade into the background. It's almost like there's a version of you living in their heart, and every time they think about that version of you, they soften a little. And honestly, I think that's part of the reason they're beginning to consider reaching out. Not because they suddenly have all the answers. In fact, I still feel quite a bit of uncertainty around them, but they're no longer comfortable with the distance the way they once were. Something inside them keeps whispering that this story doesn't feel finished. What's interesting is that the Page of Cups card comes through with a very different energy, because this isn't someone trying to control the situation. Quite the opposite. This feels like someone learning how to be more honest with their emotions. Maybe there was a time when they always tried to appear strong, always tried to convince themselves they were fine, that they didn't need anyone, that eventually everything would work itself out. But lately, I feel like those protective walls have been getting thinner. They're starting to admit to themselves that some things are still sitting in their heart. Some words were never spoken. Some emotions were never fully released. And the longer I sit with these cards, the more I sense the energy of an apology. Not because anyone is forcing them. Not because they're drowning in guilt, but because they're beginning to understand the impact of their past choices. Can I tell you something? Sometimes people don't recognize the value of a conversation until it's over. Sometimes they don't understand the importance of someone's presence until that presence is no longer part of their everyday life. And I feel like this person is moving through that exact realization. They're looking back on the connection with a level of maturity that wasn't there before. Maybe in the past they assumed there would always be more time, that things would somehow work themselves out, that important conversations could wait until later. But their perspective feels very different now. Okay, the Ace of Pentacles card brings in something really beautiful here, because this energy isn't only about feelings. It's about intention. It's about wanting to build something differently, something more genuine, more grounded, more stable, more real. I don't get the feeling that this person wants to repeat old cycles. Actually, I feel the opposite. I feel them asking themselves difficult questions. If they had the chance to do things differently, what would they do? If they had the opportunity to reconnect, what would they say? If they found themselves standing in front of Aquarius again, what would they bring with them, instead of the walls they once hid behind? It feels like they've been preparing for something internally long before any visible action takes place. Like someone rewriting the same text message over and over without ever hitting send. Like someone driving past a familiar place and lingering there longer than usual. Like someone picking up their phone, then putting it back down again. Not because they don't want to reach out, but because they want whatever comes next to be as sincere as possible. And Aquarius, I don't think this is only about communication. I think it's also about repair. Because there are people who return simply because they're lonely. But this energy feels different. What I'm seeing here is someone beginning to understand that certain things need healing before a conversation can truly mean something. And that realization is changing them little by little. Because the deeper I look into this energy, the less focused they seem on what they want. And the more they seem to wonder how you felt through everything that happened. What your experience was. What your perspective might have been. And honestly, that may be the first time they've truly allowed themselves to stand in your shoes. And I think this is where the energy begins to move beyond ordinary emotions. Because when the Star card appears again in a reading like this, I don't experience it as a card of hope alone. Honestly, it feels much deeper than that. It feels like an awakening. It's almost like this person has been looking back over their journey, and suddenly realizing that some people enter our lives not to change our daily routine, but to change the way we see the world. And Aquarius, I can't help but feel that you've been that kind of energy for this person. You made them question things they had never questioned before. You encouraged them to look at certain situations from a wider perspective. In fact, it almost feels as though before they met you, they had been living inside a very familiar framework for a long time. Everything had a rule, everything had an order, everything had a clearly defined boundary. And then you came along with an entirely different way of looking at things. Not because you were trying to change them, not because you were trying to convince them of anything, but simply by being yourself. I keep picking up memories of conversations they may not have fully understood at the time. Conversations about life, about choices, about possibilities they had never really considered before. And what's interesting is that some of the things you said long ago seem to be resurfacing now. A sentence suddenly comes back to them while they're working. A thought returns while they're sitting alone in their car after a long day. Or they're staring out a window and unexpectedly remembering something they once dismissed without much thought. And what's fascinating is that the memories aren't always the big moments. Sometimes it's the smallest details that stay with them. The way you ask questions, the way you approached a problem, the way you never seemed afraid to be different. The Queen of Swords card comes through here with such a distinct energy. It makes me think of someone who isn't trying to please everyone around them. Someone who speaks the truth as honestly as they know how. And I feel like this is something they're beginning to understand about you on a much deeper level. Maybe there was a time when they thought you were too different, too difficult to understand, too independent. But now they're starting to see what was underneath all of that. They're beginning to realize that your authenticity was never a barrier. It was a gift, because so many people live according to expectations. So many people say what others want to hear. But Aquarius carries the energy of someone willing to look at life from a completely different angle. And I think that left a much deeper impact than they ever realized, you know? I also feel like something is changing in the way this person sees themselves. Because when someone is exposed to a new perspective, they don't just start seeing the world differently. Eventually, they start seeing themselves differently too. They begin asking questions. Why did I react that way? Why was I afraid of that? Why did I hold on to certain beliefs for so long? And sometimes those questions lead to profound internal changes. Okay, the Sun card appears here, and suddenly the entire energy feels brighter. Not because every problem disappears. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because clarity is beginning to emerge. It's like watching the first sunlight appear after hours of dim gray skies. The landscape hasn't changed. The road is still there. Everything remains exactly where it was, but now it's easier to see. And I feel like that's exactly what this person is experiencing. Things they didn't understand before, they're beginning to understand now. Things they once took for granted, they're beginning to appreciate now. And perhaps the most significant realization of all is that they're starting to recognize that something had been missing from their life. Not because they lacked goals, not because they lacked achievements, but because there are certain people who bring a very specific kind of light into our lives. The kind of light that inspires us to become a better version of ourselves. And Aquarius, I honestly feel like that's what they're recognizing here. This person isn't just missing you. They're beginning to understand the impact you've had on their life. And as that awareness continues to expand, it's starting to challenge beliefs they once thought would never change. It's almost like a new door has quietly opened inside of them. And the deeper they step into that transformation, the more clearly they begin to see a truth they may have never fully allowed themselves to face before. And sometimes, those moments of clarity are exactly what make a person realize they've been living in uncertainty far longer than they thought. Because when the Moon card appears here, I don't experience it as deception coming from the outside world. Honestly, it feels more like layers of fog someone created to protect themselves, assumptions, fears, stories they told themselves to explain something their heart wasn't quite ready to face. Aquarius, I feel like this person spent a long time trying to understand everything through logic. They wanted things to make sense. They wanted clear reasons, clear evidence, immediate answers. But emotions don't always work that way. Some connections become more confusing the harder you try to analyze them. Some feelings grow stronger the more you try to control them. And I think that's exactly what happened here. There were moments when they convinced themselves this wasn't that important. Moments when they believed time would naturally make everything fade away. Moments when they thought that if they stayed busy enough with work, responsibilities, or everything else happening around them, these feelings would eventually disappear. But instead of disappearing, those feelings simply move deeper inside, quietly, silently, waiting for the moment they could no longer be ignored. What really stands out to me is the energy of the Seven of Cups card, because this card makes me feel like there were a lot of assumptions living between the two of you. Maybe they believed they knew exactly how Aquarius felt. Maybe they thought they fully understood your intentions. Or perhaps they were looking at the present through the lens of old experiences without even realizing it. You know, it's like someone who was hurt a long time ago. After that experience, they start moving through life with their guard up. Even when no real danger is standing in front of them, they're already preparing themselves for disappointment, already expecting something to go wrong. And I feel like this person is beginning to realize that some of the things they believed weren't entirely true. Not because they meant to misunderstand, but because fear has a way of distorting perception. It makes us hear things that were never said. It makes us see problems where there may not actually be any. It pushes us away from what we truly want simply because vulnerability feels uncomfortable. But sooner or later, the truth always finds a way to surface. And that's where the Judgment card starts becoming incredibly powerful. Because I don't see judgment here, I see awakening. Wow. It's almost like someone waking up from a very long dream, opening their eyes and realizing there were things they missed, things they misunderstood, feelings they kept giving different names to because they weren't ready to face what those feelings actually were. And Aquarius, I genuinely feel like this person is moving through that exact experience right now. They're looking back on the entire journey through different eyes, no longer viewing everything solely from their own perspective, no longer looking through the lens of old wounds, no longer looking through the lens of fear. They're beginning to look through the lens of truth. And what's interesting is that truth is often much simpler than we expect, because I feel like they're realizing that some things they once believed were complicated were actually very clear. There were signs they overlooked, emotions they pushed aside, moments they considered ordinary that now seem filled with meaning. It's like reading a book again years later. The book hasn't changed. The words are exactly the same, but you've changed. And because you've changed, everything inside the story feels different. That's the feeling I keep getting here. This person is looking back at Aquarius with a completely different awareness, no longer through the filter of doubt, no longer through the filter of fear, no longer through assumptions built from old experiences. And the more those layers of fog begin to fall away, the more clearly they see something they may have never truly allowed themselves to acknowledge before. Something that seems to become clearer with each passing day. Something they can no longer keep turning away from. Because for the first time in a very long time, they're beginning to face their real feelings without trying to explain them away. And maybe that's the moment when distance begins to accomplish something that closeness never could. Because sometimes we don't truly understand the value of something while it's still part of our everyday life. We get used to it. We assume it will always be there. We assume there's plenty of time. But once an empty space appears, something starts to shift. And I feel like that's exactly where the Five of Pentacles card is leading this person. What's interesting is that I don't see this as loss in a material sense. It feels much more personal than that. Almost like something important is missing, even though everything else appears to be in place. Like walking into a room that has all the furniture, all the decorations, everything exactly where it should be, and yet somehow it still feels empty. Like life continues moving forwards as usual, but emotionally something doesn't feel the same anymore. Aquarius, I think this person is beginning to realize that you brought far more into their life than they once recognized. Not just conversations, not just companionship, but a very specific energy, a feeling that inspired them, a feeling that encouraged them to see things differently, a feeling that connected them to parts of themselves they didn't often explore. And now that that energy isn't showing up as frequently, they're beginning to notice the difference. I keep seeing images of someone moving through their ordinary routine, going to work, driving home, picking up groceries, taking care of responsibilities, living what looks like a completely normal life. But scattered throughout those ordinary moments are these unexpected pauses. A song reminds them of you. A place they once visited with you catches their attention. Someone casually says something that brings back a memory. And for a few brief seconds, everything comes rushing back. The Six of Cups card appears here carrying so many memories. But what I'm feeling isn't simple nostalgia. It's awareness. Because now they're not just remembering the good moments. They're beginning to understand why those moments mattered. Certain memories that once sat quietly in the background of their mind have now become the memories they revisit most often. Maybe it was a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time, a moment when the two of you shared something personal, a memory they never expected to hold on to for this long. And yet those simple experiences have become the very things that make them stop and reflect. Then the Three of Swords card appears. And honestly, it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels more like a truth that can no longer be avoided. Because sometimes pain doesn't come from losing someone. Sometimes it comes from realizing you didn't fully understand their value while you still had the opportunity to appreciate it. And that's exactly what I feel happening here. This person isn't just missing Aquarius. They're revisiting their choices. The moments they stayed silent. The moments they waited too long. The moments they assumed there would always be another chance later. And every time they look back, they seem to understand a little more about the impact those decisions had. There's a maturity emerging within this energy, because instead of blaming circumstances, instead of blaming timing, instead of blaming other people, they're starting to look inward. They're beginning to ask themselves different questions. What truly matters to me? What genuinely makes me feel alive? What actually gives my life meaning? And Aquarius, I think distance forced them to sit with those questions. Because there are lessons that only separation can teach. There are truths that only silence can reveal. And within those quiet moments, they're starting to hear their inner voice more clearly. Not the voice of fear, not the voice of doubt, not the voice of old assumptions that once kept them confused, but something much simpler. Something they spent a long time trying to understand with their mind and are only now beginning to feel with their heart. And the more honest they become with themselves, the more they realize that certain desires have been living inside them for a very long time. Desires they weren't quite ready to name before. Desires they weren't fully prepared to acknowledge. But now, as those protective walls continue to come down, those feelings seem to be stepping out of the shadows little by little, becoming clearer, becoming stronger, and becoming much harder to ignore than they ever were before. And when someone finally understands what their heart has been trying to say for a very long time, a very natural need often begins to emerge. A need to speak, a need to explain, a need to be honest. And that's exactly where the energy of the Ace of Swords card becomes impossible to ignore. Aquarius, I can't help but feel like this person has spent far too much time inside their own head. Too many conversations that nobody else ever heard. Too many imagined answers. Too many scenarios playing over and over in their mind. But the more they've thought about everything, the more they've realized that some things simply cannot be resolved through silence alone. Some things can only be understood through an honest conversation. What's interesting is that I feel this person standing at the edge of a major shift in the way they communicate, because for a long time, their instinct was to keep everything inside. If something confused them, they would deal with it alone. If something hurt them, they would try to work through it privately. If something frightened them, they would focus on controlling the feeling instead of sharing it. But somehow, that approach doesn't seem to be working anymore. They're beginning to understand that silence doesn't always protect a connection. Sometimes silence creates a greater distance than any disagreement ever could. And what I keep noticing here is how much they're thinking about everything that was left unsaid. Not just apologies, not just explanations, but genuine feelings. The kind of feelings that may have been difficult to express before. The kind of feelings they may not have even known how to put into words. Honestly, it feels like they've been rehearsing a conversation in their mind again and again. A conversation they've postponed for far too long. They wonder how they would begin, what they would say first, what they would explain, what they would finally admit, because they're starting to understand something important. Some misunderstandings aren't created by a lack of feeling. They're created by a lack of communication. There are times when two people experience the same situation, but carry completely different assumptions about it. There are times when both people wait for the other person to speak first. There are times when both people assume they are understood, when in reality, neither person truly knows what the other has been carrying inside. And I think this person is beginning to see that now. The Eight of Wands card comes through here with the feeling of movement. Like water that has been blocked for far too long, finally finding a way forward. I don't get the sense that this energy wants to keep waiting. Actually, it feels like the opposite. With each passing day, they seem to feel a stronger need to clarify something, a stronger need to open up about something, a stronger need to create a genuine connection instead of living entirely inside their own thoughts. And what makes this so significant is that this urge isn't coming from impulse. It's coming from awareness, from everything they've learned during this process, from the distance, from the memories, from the things they misunderstood, from the truths they've slowly uncovered along the way. And that's exactly why the judgment card appears here once again, not as a judgment, not as criticism, but as another awakening, almost like a bell ringing through a quiet room, waking up parts of themselves that have been asleep for far too long. I feel like this person is beginning to accept a very simple truth. They can no longer pretend that none of this matters. They can no longer act as if these feelings don't exist. They can no longer ignore what their heart has been trying to show them for such a long time. And Aquarius, can I tell you something? Sometimes the hardest truth to speak isn't the one we share with another person. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one we finally admit to ourselves. And I feel like this person is moving through that exact moment. They're becoming more honest with themselves, more honest about what they feel, more honest about what they regret, more honest about what they genuinely want. And the more that honesty grows, the more it begins changing the way they view the conversation they've been afraid of. Because instead of seeing it as a risk, they're beginning to see it as an opportunity to finally say what needs to be said. An opportunity to clear away misunderstandings that have existed for far too long. An opportunity to let someone know what was really happening behind all that silence. And as they move closer and closer to that clarity, I can't help but feel that something else is quietly taking shape inside them. Something that goes beyond what they want to say. Something that reaches beyond the conversation itself. Because little by little, they're beginning to imagine something they weren't allowing themselves to imagine before. Not just a different conversation, but a different future altogether. And what's fascinating is that after everything that's been shifting inside them, the energy no longer feels focused on looking back. It's beginning to look forward, not in some distant or unrealistic way, not through perfect fantasies, but in a way that feels grounded, mature, and honestly, very different from the energy I was picking up on before. Because when the Lover's card appears here, I don't just see feelings, I see a choice. A choice that comes after a great deal of reflection, a great deal of experience, and a great deal of learning. Aquarius. I feel like this person is beginning to understand that some connections cannot remain in the maybe someday category forever. Some people cannot continue existing as a vague possibility somewhere in the future. Eventually, the heart starts asking for a clearer answer, and I think they're getting closer to that moment. What's really standing out to me is that they used to approach life in separate pieces. Today was today. This week was this week, one problem at a time, one responsibility at a time. But now I see them beginning to think further ahead, beginning to look at a much bigger picture. It's almost like they're asking themselves questions they've never allowed themselves to ask before. What if this person is still part of my life years from now? What if I actually build something lasting? What if I stop being afraid and start being honest about what I truly want? And those questions seem to be opening an entirely new way of thinking. The Ten of Cups card comes through here with such a warm energy, not the energy of grand promises, not unrealistic expectations, but simple moments, a meal shared after a long day, a conversation where nobody feels the need to be guarded, a sense of peace that comes from knowing someone is there. Honestly, I don't think the intensity of their feelings is what's changing. I think what's changing is the way they define happiness. Maybe there was a time when they were chasing different goals, different achievements, different versions of success they believed would make them feel complete. But now they're beginning to realize that happiness often lives inside very ordinary moments. And what's interesting is that many of those images seem to include Aquarius. I feel them slowly connecting emotion with reality, what they feel with what they actually want to build. And that's exactly why the Four of Wands card feels so important here. Because this is no longer a story about temporary emotions. This is a story about foundations, about stability, about the desire to create something that can stand the test of time. Aquarius. I get the sense that this person spent a long time questioning whether feelings could really be trusted. They were afraid of decisions made from the heart, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of investing in something they couldn't completely control. But now, something is changing, and it's a significant shift. Their heart and their mind no longer seem to be standing on opposite sides of the room. It's almost like they're finally sitting at the same table, listening to one another, finding common ground, because their mind is beginning to see what their heart may have known for quite a while. and their heart is learning how to express itself more clearly instead of remaining silent. And honestly, it's a beautiful process to witness, a mature process, a healing process, one that is changing the way they view this connection entirely, because they no longer see it as something temporary passing through their life. I even feel them beginning to imagine versions of the future they never gave themselves permission to imagine before. Not because they're trying to force anything to happen, not because they're clinging to a particular outcome, but because for the first time, those thoughts don't seem to frighten them anymore. In fact, they seem to bring a sense of peace, like someone who has finally found a direction they genuinely want to follow. And as those images become clearer and clearer in their mind, another realization quietly begins to take shape. One that has less to do with what they're feeling, and more to do with what they're willing to release. Because sometimes creating space for a new chapter isn't about adding something new. Sometimes it's about letting go of what no longer belongs there. And maybe that's the most beautiful thing about real change. It rarely happens in one dramatic moment. Most of the time, it happens quietly, little by little, one small decision at a time. One moment at a time when a person chooses to release the past instead of continuing to carry it forward. And that's exactly the feeling I get from the Four of Pentacles card in reverse. Aquarius. I feel like this person is getting tired of holding on to everything, holding on to fear, holding on to control, holding on to all the reasons that kept them from stepping beyond their comfort zone. You know, some people think letting go means losing something, but sometimes letting go is the only way to create space for something new. And I think that's what this person is slowly beginning to understand. They don't seem interested in spending all of their energy protecting old walls anymore. They don't want to analyze every possible outcome before taking a single step. They don't want to live entirely inside their thoughts while ignoring what their heart has been trying to say. Honestly, the energy feels lighter now, more open, more gentle. It's almost like someone who has been carrying an incredibly heavy suitcase for years and finally realizes they don't need to carry all of it anymore. And what's beautiful is that the moment this energy appears, the Temperance card appears right beside it. I've always experienced the Temperance card as a very natural kind of healing, not forced, not rushed, not something that needs to be proven to anyone. It's like muddy water gradually becoming clear after being left undisturbed for long enough. Like someone slowly finding their balance again after living with inner conflict for a very long time. I keep feeling that a lot is being rearranged behind the scenes, not in a loud way, not in a way that everyone can see, but through subtle shifts happening inside their awareness, inside their heart, inside the way they view themselves, the way they view Aquarius, and the way they view what truly matters. And that's exactly why the Star card appears again. Wow, this card has continued showing up throughout the entire reading. And that makes me feel like this message isn't only for the person thinking about you. I think part of it is meant for Aquarius too, because sometimes when a connection moves through a lot of change, the easiest thing to do is start doubting your own intuition. Start questioning whether you're seeing things clearly, wondering if you're being too optimistic, or maybe too pessimistic, wondering if you've missed something important. But the Star card always brings us back to our inner knowing. Back to the truth our heart may have recognized long before our mind could explain it. Not so we can control the outcome, not so we can force life to move in a particular direction, but so we can remain connected to ourselves. And Aquarius, I honestly feel like you're being encouraged to trust your intuition, to continue listening to what brings you peace rather than what comes from fear, to continue moving at the pace that feels right for you. Because sometimes not seeing everything on the surface doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes important things are still unfolding beneath the surface. Then the World card appears. And to me, it feels like the sign of a cycle gradually reaching completion. Not completion as an ending, but completion as growth. Like a lesson that has finally been understood. Like an old version of yourself gently being laid to rest. Like an outdated perspective making room for a new one. I actually feel like both energies in this reading are walking through a similar doorway. Neither of them stands where they once stood. Neither of them sees things the same way they once did. Neither of them is carrying the exact same beliefs they carried before. And as those old cycles begin to close, a new space starts opening. A space filled with more clarity, more honesty, more maturity. It's almost like scattered puzzle pieces that once seemed disconnected are finally beginning to find where they belong. And the longer I sit with this energy, the more I feel that the real turning point isn't one single event. It isn't one conversation. It isn't one moment. It's all of the quiet changes that have been happening beneath the surface this entire time. The small shifts, the subtle realizations, the gradual healing, the choices nobody else could see. And together, those changes seem to be guiding everything toward a very different crossroads than either of them once imagined they would reach.